Hello and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast series. We bring to you today the second edition in our special series on civil services reform, a conversation between me, Yamini Aiyar, President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, and Dr KP Krishnan, Honorary Professor at the Center for Policy Research. In our last discussion, Dr. Krishnan and I spoke about the original design of the All India services as envisaged in the Indian Constitution, and Dr. Krishnan walked us through key elements of the design features. And we also spoke a little bit about how over the course of the last 75 years, there have been transitions as the civil services itself evolved and moved in a new direction, different from where the original design had conceptualized the structure and functioning of the civil services. Today, we are going to talk in more detail about the specific changes that have been underway, both explicit, i.e. by virtue of policy directions and specific policy changes, as well as implicit. After all, the civil services is located within a complex social and political structure, and its evolution will indeed reflect the changes underway in Indian society, Indian polity, and Indian economy. So to start us off, Dr. Krishnan, let me ask you to tell us about some of the more concerted and very specific policy changes that were introduced, aimed at changing some of the original design features of the civil services. You mentioned three in your in the chapters, Civil Services Reforms 1 and 2. So just wanted our listeners to hear a little bit about that from you.
Thank you, Yamini, and greetings to you and the audience. It's a pleasure to be back in this conversation with you. In terms of explicit design changes, the Civil Service 1 and 2 talk about essentially three, or ideally actually 3 plus 1, 4 changes. A, the increase in the promotion quota, the numbers that come from the state services. Second is the overall increase in reservations. The third is the upper age limit, the changing age limit for appearing in the civil service exam, and associated with it, but technically a separate fourth feature, in my opinion, would be the number of attempts. Now, let's go back very briefly to the initial features. All India, not only in name, but in character, and selection purely on merit by an apolitical, distant, independent commission, and protection from arbitrary punishment. Now, these are some of the features that we had discussed in some detail. Now, the explicit changes that I mentioned, let's start with the first one. The promotion from the state civil services. If you recall, towards the end of the last conversation, I had elaborated on the second category of promotion. Actually, from the state, there is a category of the state civil service. Then there is the state non-civil service. Namely, if you take, say, Uttar Pradesh, there is the Uttar Pradesh PCS. So there is a large percentage of people from the Uttar Pradesh provincial civil service who will constitute a bulk of the state promotion to the IAS, that quota. But there is a percentage, smaller in size, which comes from the non-state civil services. It could be a public works engineer, it could be a medical doctor, it could be a women and child development project officer, it could be, there is a whole range of state administrative services other than the civil service from which people can come in. Now, the total percentage that constituted this state quota was explicitly increased from 25 to 33%. Now, that's in itself important, but something else which we allude to in our paper, which I don't think a lot of people realize, the 33% is to be calculated on a different denominator. The definition of the denominator was changed and actually expanded. So in absolute numbers, the increase is actually far, far higher. So I was explaining to you last time, there is something called senior duty post, then there is state deputation reserve, there is central deputation reserve. So what constitutes the final cadre of a state like Karnataka or Tamil Nadu or Uttar Pradesh is, say, number X. Of that, the senior duty posts would be some percentage of X. Then there are these adds on. The original 25% was on a denominator which was less than the total X. Because remember the design, all India in character. And if I want to preserve all India in character and I am promoting a large number of people from the state, then I need a much larger non-state, namely outsiders, into the direct recruitment pool. So this number has a significance for both all India character as well as for age of entry. By definition, the state promotee is a person who's coming in after a certain number of years of service. In most states, it's 20 plus years. So you're not talking about the youth entering the civil service. So this number, 25 to 33% increase, is also on a different denominator. So the actual increase in the quota of promotees from the state cadres is actually much higher. This, in one sense, very fundamentally alters the character of the IAS cadre, likewise for the police service and the forest service, and increases people from the state, increases the more aged, the more experienced people. And what is the implication of that? Recall, our original discussion also referred to an objective of the civil service was challenging the existing social order, because that was an explicit objective of the state. Enforcing legislations like temple entry, land reforms, a whole bunch of other social legislations and poverty alleviation. The very implicit but strongly implicit argument was idealistic, young, fresh from college type people. Now, this change fundamentally changes the character of the civil service. So this is an important development.
So I'm going to stay with this for a moment to ask you two questions. The first is that one of the implications of age, presumably then, is that you get a slightly older, potentially slightly more experienced person in a district collectorate, district magistrate kind of role. And one of the criticisms that we have often heard of the IAS in its current structure is a lot of power rests on very young shoulders and relatively inexperienced shoulders at the start of the career. So when you get, what has this done in terms of shifting the way in which district administration takes place? And I'll ask my second question, although it's a little different, just to keep the flow of our conversation going, which is, when we then start getting, in some ways what you describe is that the elite character of the All India services now starts changing over time as you get older and more state cadres in. What does this do to the culture or the spirit of the All India civil services? Do we see any explicit shifts between the then and now as a consequence of the changing composition?
So the first question, in terms of this youth versus experience, clearly, if you see the initial debates, and we refer to some of them in our Civil Service 1 paper, there is recognition that any administrative setup, whether it's government, private sector, not-for-profit bodies, by definition requires a combination of some entrepreneurial risk-taking, but perhaps some amount of mistakes embedded, youths, which will try out a whole bunch of new things, but which will also be bold. Will be willing to charter into territory that more experienced, wiser people will not want to get into. To just give you a perspective, my batch was a batch of 6 of us. In 1983, 6 of us, almost all broadly the same age, youngsters, 3 insiders, 3 outsiders went into Karnataka. We manned 6, turns out all of us were men. So manned is not
Politically correct.
politically, it's factually correct. I'm not sure it's politically correct. So the 6 of us were holding subdivisions out of how many in Karnataka? A total of then 50 plus subdivisions. Now, assuming the 2 batches are at present in subdivisions, at most, you're talking about 12 out of 50. The numbers have gone up since then, meaning the number of subdivisions have gone up. So it is a smaller number. Therefore, the system always used to pick difficult areas which required a serious attempt. For instance, land reforms was a major agenda in the coastal parts of Karnataka. The South Canara, North Canara area had large numbers of tenancies, and therefore large numbers of IAS officers would get posted to subdivisions like Kundapur, Puttur, because these, though technically just constituting 2 subdivisions, were disproportionately important in the social agenda of the state. But to come back, 12 of us at a given point in time is not a large enough number to fundamentally alter the youth and experience balance, because the balance 38 is with either direct recruit state civil servants who are at least on an average 7 to 8 years older, or much more likely promotees who joined as tahsildars or even lower. So if you take the average age profile at this cutting edge subdivisional level officer, you are not talking about a very large number, number one. Number two, you are always above and below you are experienced people. Your tahsildars are all likely to be elderly, wise, experienced people. Your additional collector is likely to be an elderly person. Collector will at least be, even if he's or she's a direct recruit, a person of 8-10 years of experience would have seen districts and beyond. So in my personal opinion, and this is what is reflected in the paper, this combination of 25% of a lower denominator, I think amounted to the right balance. It's a matter of judgment. And this was the judgment of the then government, the Constituent Assembly. And this is my judgment, our judgment, Somanathan and my judgment, that this was the right balance. And you needed a certain bit of brashness. I recall, there was an act in Karnataka called the Karnataka Prevention of Transfer of Certain Lands Act. I don't know if you remember, there is a spate of these legislations in the early 80s. Land grants used to be made to scheduled castes and scheduled tribe population. The idea was, if you want to empower them, they need to be endowed with land. Just giving them income assets in the form of cows and buffaloes is not the whole story. You need to empower them. Land is much more than an economic asset. So land grants were made. Very often, these people were not self-cultivating agriculturists. Agriculture requires a certain entrepreneurial ability, etc., etc. Right. Very often, they would end up selling the land and they would be cheated. They would sell the land at a fraction of its value, very often not even knowing what they were doing. So governments and legislatures brought in a legislation called Prevention of Transfer of Certain Lands. So the land grant used to be restored even if a consideration had been paid and a considerable amount had been paid. Now, restoring lands to SC/ST cultivators was a high priority when I became subdivisional officer. And we worked like maniacs, literally, 30, 40 cases a week of restoration. Now, the wiser, more experienced subdivisional officers told us, just wait, after you pass the order, come out and see what is happening. And I did it once. I had passed a PTCL order. I came out and the same quote unquote landlord was selling the same land back to the same purchaser for a higher amount. Now, this colleague subdivisional officer who was in the neighboring division told me, do you realize what you're doing? You're being very faithful, you're doing what the law requires, but is it actually adding to justice? Is it doing what was the intention? All it's adding to is some further transfer of cash from the transferee. It's not doing any serious purpose. I said, no, I am determined to implement the law. And I suspect we need that youthful idealism in parts of the government for the balance. So to answer your first question, my sense is the balance got distorted by this change. The second question related to the elite character. I think, and we I think briefly discussed it last time, in an intellectual, integrity, moral sense, I have no quarrel with the idea of elites. You need an elite in the form of higher merit, greater independence, focus on higher orders of constitutional values, because these are missing. So if by elites you mean adherence to these values and insistence on implementation of legislations which promoted those values, I think elitism was required. And bulk of the relatively younger IAS officers, my experience tells me, till about the middle of their career, seriously carried these values. So even as deputy secretaries of cooperative department, deputy secretary of land department, or deputy secretary of some other department, transport department, they would be seriously pursuing the kind of agenda that I'm talking about. And I'm tying up 1 and 2. I think the elitism is required. It is part of that initial youthful exuberance, not irrational exuberance, but exuberance, enthusiasm for a whole bunch of things which are flowing straight out of the directive principles of state policy. So the answer is yes. I was strongly in favor of that kind of elitism.
We'll dive into this a little bit more perhaps in our next discussion for the next in the series, but I think it really sets us up to understand some of the shifts. Let's now talk about the reservation issue. The late 80s were quite a seminal moment in our politics, and the Mandal Commission also then resulted in a fairly significant change in the IAS as well, in its recruitment structure, who comes in, how, brought into the forefront debates on merit versus affirmative action. From a civil service point of view, what did this do to shift its character, both away from the original design and more broadly?
I think the reservation for SC/ST was never a matter of debate or an issue. It's been in the IAS from day one, and I think there is complete acknowledgement and recognition that it's actually part of the design. And in a sense, the Indian Administrative Service and the All India Services are, besides being important arms of the state, in a very sort of more holistic sense, they are also serious empowerment of the individual. So people belonging to the SC/ST joining the IAS, I think, had both a symbolism and an important message in terms of empowerment. I think that was never in doubt. The OBC reservations, which came in the mid-80s, remember, it also came more or less coinciding with the time when post 90, the numbers in recruitment were drastically coming down. So batch sizes, my batch size was 128 or 132. It was a fairly large batch. And by the early 90s, we were talking about batch sizes of 75 and 80. So a couple of batches before me was a batch size of 152. So we are actually talking about almost a half, sort of 50% reduction in the size of the batch. So out of 152, if you carried out the SC/ST reservations, you had something like a little over 100 plus, 112, 110 open competitive seats. But out of 75, if you did SC/ST and OBC, you are now talking about an open pool of 32. Now, 32 as opposed to 112 is a big reduction in number. So what I recall from those days is this number, the reduction in this number was a very stark thing which stood out. Closely related to this is the third serious change in design, because this second and the third in a sense went together. The number of attempts and the age limit for the reserved category students was also higher. Now, if you had people who were coming in after multiple attempts and at a later age, as somebody, in fact, I think it was Somanathan who calculated and showed us that there was a particular time this underwent, there were lots of flip-flops. The number of attempts was increased to X, it became X by X minus 2, then it became X plus 2, a series of changes that took place, likewise in the number of attempts. I remember Somanathan showing me that you could potentially have a subdivisional officer on his first posting at the age of 42. Now, Somanathan and I were subdivisional officers at 22 or 23. Now, 22 and 42 are fundamentally different. And subdivisional officers from the direct recruit IAS at 42 is the exact opposite of the design. Because a 42-year-old subdivisional officer is not an unknown thing. He or she would be a state service or a state Tahsildar promotee or a state revenue inspector promotee. As against this would be the 23, 24, 25-year-old direct recruit IAS officer, and that would constitute the balance of youth, experience, age, etc. But if you began to get direct recruit IAS officers at 42 and there were direct recruit administrative service officers of the state who were 35, you fundamentally changed this design. I think this has implications. These implications are not easy to measure, but they are very easy to observe. They are easy to see. The young IAS sub-collector or the young KS sub-collector would rush to a law and order problem at midnight. We had a Kaveri related issue in Karnataka at that time. The usual release of water to Tamil Nadu and farmers coming and camping near the sluice gates, or there was something called the Venkat Swamy Ayoga, the Venkat Swamy Commission, which had made recommendations on OBC reservations in the state, series of agitations in the state, and all kinds of hours of the day, there would be a law and order call. And we were not in a police commissioner area, we were in a CRPC area. So very often the subdivisional magistrate had to be present. And I recall in my neighboring subdivision, which had an even greater problem, my counterpart was on the verge of retirement. He was 58. He was a state civil service promotee. He would keep saying, "Sir, why do you keep rushing to the spot? I have to do likewise. If you keep going to the spot with your police at 58, how do you expect me to do it?" It is a valid question, but the answer is you can't have a 58-year-old subdivisional officer, which requires an energetic young fellow running around. So I think the implications are severe. And I think these are what I have in mind. So it's not really a comment. If you see our paper, it's very carefully analyzed. We don't say anything about the reservation itself because that's a much larger debate and it goes beyond the civil service. If the Indian polity decides that we need an OBC reservation, we need an OBC reservation. That's not a matter of debate. But the implications that it has for the civil service are to be then understood by the civil service, and given the original design, should we then rejig? Is the question that I want to sort of pose.
Actually, we'll come to that. And related, you mentioned something very interesting, which I don't think people fully understand. Because when you think about the bureaucracy, in the public imagination, it's this large labyrinth filled with lots of people, with lots of inefficient things. But you said that the recruitment size has dropped quite significantly over the course of the decades. Can you explain to us why?
It's actually a bit of a paradox because in the early 90s, and some of this I've seen at close quarters, I was with the Minister for Personnel when this whole business of liberalization is happening. The state will retreat. Industrial licensing is not anymore an activity that the government does. Control of capital issues is given up. That's going to be done by an organization called SEBI. Why do we need such a large civil service? I think a bit of a very lazy armchair type analysis was done. And whoever was calculating had come to the conclusion that we needed something like half of the actual annual recruitment size. And for my recollection, if I'm right, for about 10, 12 years, I think starting 92, 93, I could be wrong by a year or two, till about 2003, 4, our batch sizes became half, 70s, 60s, and this paradoxically at a time when the number of districts in India were actually increasing, which means the number of subdivisions were increasing. And why is that important? The senior duty posts are calculated keeping in mind the number of districts, because the district collector is what is called a cadre post. This is jargon, which in plain English means the district collector will be an IAS officer by law. So it's not somebody's sort of personnel related individual decision. The law says the district collector, and likewise, say registrar of cooperative societies, commissioner of food and civil supplies. These are enumerated by designation. The senior duty posts are listed out in something called a cadre notification, and it's the collective judgment of the state and the union government that these posts will be manned by officers of the cadre. So, number of districts are increasing, and if you recall, around that time, Yamini, many universities in India were going through various Jindabad, Murdabad type of agitation. Very often, registrars of the universities used to be drawn from the IAS because the academic community said it shall not be one of us, because if the biology guy comes, the psychology guy has a problem, etc., etc. Likewise, there were a series of scandals about exam results and things like that. So controller of exams of universities also used to get drawn from the IAS. So paradoxically, the jobs in which the IAS officers were getting deployed, including newly created infrastructure bodies, airport states were not doing airports because it is a list one subject.
Correct.
But states began to partner with government of India and doing stuff on airports, and those companies used to be manned / personed by IAS officers. So you have this paradox of so-called retreat of the state, therefore arguing for reduction in the cadre, and an actual reduction in the cadre taking place alongside an expansion in the number of jobs into which the IAS officers are getting deployed. I think that consequence was very serious because I know in my state, a whole bunch of cadre posts ended up not being occupied by cadre officers. And now routinely, a large number of Zilla Panchayats and Zilla Panchayats in Karnataka are very important. I mean, they spend now on an average 4/5-digit crores per district per annum. We are not talking about small sums of money. And they have actually done this coordination and centralization where the chief executive officer of the Zilla Panchayat actually is in charge of the entire developmental activities in the district. Large districts with 5-digit crores, 4-digit crores not being manned by administrators of the kind that were envisaged to manage it is, I think, a problem. But I think this is a problem which now seems to be slowly sort of coming to an end because the numbers have got restored. I think in the last 5-10 years, we've gone back to recruiting larger numbers.
This relates to one more change, structural change that was a policy, explicit policy shift, which you don't sort of talk about front and center in the chapters, but I was curious to get your view on. This period also coincided with the 73rd and 74th Amendment. And that led to, at the district level, particularly the merging of the District Rural Development Authority in various states. It took place over a period of time. But also in that process, a kind of clearer division between what the developmental functions of the district is supposed to be versus the revenue and law and order functions of what the district is supposed to be. So to what extent did the 73rd, 74th Amendment, if at all, lead to any kind of structural shifts within the administration and the IAS in particular? Just wanted to get a better sense from you on that.
Changes that took place on account of the, for instance, coordination and centralization of developmental functions in Zilla Panchayat, sadly, is not actually a consequence of 73rd and 74th. For instance, in Karnataka, Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde and Abdul Nazir Saab, who were, I think, intellectually, seriously wedded to the idea of democratic decentralization, went ahead and passed the Local Bodies Act. It's a long title, Zilla Panchayats, etc., etc. I think the first act is of 1983, where legislatively they empowered Zilla Panchayats to an order that is unimaginable. Now, notwithstanding the 73rd Amendment, not very many states in India have actually done this.
Yes.
So they have persisted, for the record, they'll have a Zilla Panchayat, but a bulk of the functions continue to be either with the collector or with the additional collector who continues to head something called a DRDA or, some body by a similar name.
Yeah.
Likewise, the empowerment of the urban local body that was envisaged in these amendments didn't really happen across the board in India. However, take the example of Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu historically always used to have a senior time-scale IAS officer as commissioner of Coimbatore Municipal Corporation, Coimbatore City Corporation, Madurai City Corporation, very often Tiruchirappalli. So the big corporation cities or whatever is the official classification, the corporation, the higher order municipal bodies in Tamil Nadu historically had IAS officers as commissioners. The advantage being, it also created a bunch of experts on cutting edge urban issues, both for the state administration and for the Union of India. Likewise, Maharashtra. And interestingly, if you go and see the honor board of urban development secretaries in Government of India and joint secretaries who used to handle programs like the integrated development of small and medium towns or programs that funded urban water supply, you would very often find Mr. Suktankar, Mr. Dharmarajan, a whole bunch of people, Srinivasan, who were all people who had been municipal commissioners early on in their lives, and Deputy Commissioner, Chennai City Corporation, Corporation Commissioner of Chennai, Urban Development of Tamil Nadu. So, Tamil Nadu, independently of the 73rd, 74th Amendment, always used to have people working in key urban positions. Karnataka had key people, large numbers. Our batches were all posted as CEOs of ZPs, completely irrespective of the 73rd, 74th Amendment. So, to quickly therefore summarize, I think whatever took place in decentralized local urban bodies took place independently of 73rd, 74th Amendment, largely driven by the ethos of the individual state. You don't necessarily see this in many other states. Likewise, people tell me about the West Bengal land reforms experiment, Operation Barga, if you recall. D. Bandyopadhyaya, a very celebrated officer of West Bengal cadre, Devabrata Bandyopadhyaya, almost considered the father of land reforms in terms of legislation, extremely knowledgeable. I think the times that he was in charge of this, every officer on completion of his initial subdivision was posted to land reforms in Bengal. Settlement, land reforms, all of the land related legislations, which is the core sovereign function, but that is a very peculiar Bengal ethos. So I suspect it varies from state to state. I don't think there is a clear all India pattern.
So let's move on to the not so explicit changes that seem to have taken place, moving the civil services, as it were, away from its original design. And in your chapters, you talk about a bunch of them, but let's start with the original design of the All India character and dual control, that state representation into the central cadre. And you show in your book, that in your chapters, that in fact, there are now some states that are heavily overrepresented, others are not. So could you talk to us about why the central deputation story of how the All India character and the dual control narrative was to unfold didn't quite work out, or has taken on a slightly different form in contemporary times?
In fact, I'll elaborate on this a little beyond what we have written in the paper, because I think a lot of the sort of real nuances come in the form of a bunch of live examples. The design all along was Union of India does not have a bureaucracy of its own for the generalist senior cadres. It will have a bunch of specialists. So the income tax service, the customs excise, the P&T finance and accounts, the railway accounts, these specialist cadres exist in the union, but the generalist cadre in the union has a small service called the Central Secretariat Service, who typically man the lower order and the middle order management posts. But the higher order was supposed to be necessarily drawn from the Indian Administrative Service, the logic being All India, not in name only, but in character. So the Union Agriculture Secretary is expected to be an informed generalist with an All India perspective. More important, she is assisted by 6, 8, 10 joint secretaries, a couple of additional secretaries who would necessarily be from 10 different states or 12 different states. Collectively, they therefore constitute a remarkably varied but common ethos in terms of end goals. This is the design. How is this to work? Each state had a central deputation reserve. And that number, all these numbers were very scientifically calculated. So each state is to contribute a certain percentage to the central pool. And that pool, that contribution of the state is also appropriately distributed in terms of hierarchy. It's not that you have a central deputation reserve of 42 and 40 of them are deputy secretaries. The idea is some of them will be deputy secretaries, some of them will be joint secretaries, some of them will be additional, and a few of them will be secretaries. Plus, if you recall, I mentioned to you, I think in the last time, in the last conversation, that famous Mrs. Indira Gandhi noting, I think advising PC Sethi that you can't keep picking Madhya Pradesh officers. And I remember Mr. Narasimha Rao, incidentally, doing likewise. It's a minister, also happens to be from Madhya Pradesh, and he was heading the Ministry of Environment and Forests. And Mr. Narasimha Rao said, I agree that your state has a lot of forests, your officers will have forest experience, but therefore, actually pick an officer who's from a state with very little forest, because that officer is part of an all India service. He or she needs to know how does the Forest Reservation Act work. When you say no to a project on grounds of environment and forest consideration, notwithstanding the fact that you belong to a state which does not have forests, since you are an all India service officer, you need to know that dimension. And therefore, the argument that shipping will only have coastal states is wrong. So the design was truly varied cadre represented in the Union of India, but also distributed wisely, as I said, at all levels. This used to be consciously enforced by the PMO, by the cabinet secretary, and by the senior secretaries. The finance secretary would go out of the way to tell his joint secretary when he or she is going for a selection meeting, we have X number from these states. I think you should now consciously look, because at deputy secretary director level, there is no particular great experience that people will bring to the table, because they'll all have identical experience. They'll have been subdivisional officers for 3 years, district collectors for 2 years, HOD, additional HOD for 5 years. So UP, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Telangana, what have, Northeast will all be similar. So do get a balance. Now, when does this get distorted? This begins to get distorted when I think we had a cadre allocation policy where large numbers of people began to get allocated to cadres that are far, far away from home. So let's say a whole bunch of UPites or South Indians land in the Northeast. And for a variety of reasons, some of which is easily understandable. It's not easy to educate your children there. So to expect that everybody will be self-abnegating and only altruistic is not a realistic design. So a lot of what I call officers who are in fugitive cadres, the fugitives wanted to escape. And the standard example is that desperate North Indian deep inside Kerala, who after 10 years of eating shore and tapioca is desperate to eat dal roti and wants to come north.
But now paneer has spread everywhere.
So in one sense, the cuisine has become common, but people wanting to escape. So what began to happen was many of these cadres began to be overrepresented in Delhi, because the individuals would come and lobby and would come and say, I don't mind whichever post you give me, I'm happy to come in. And some cadres also began to offer excellent opportunities of work. As I mentioned, one attraction earlier to come to Government of India would be to do list one subjects.
Correct.
How would I do airports in the state? But when the airport in Karnataka became a joint venture, the KSIIDC officer, the Karnataka State Industrial Investment Development Corporation officer, was actually getting a terrific exposure to civil aviation. So quote unquote, some of the better off states, the more progressive states, the relatively economically more affluent states also began to not send adequate numbers of officers. Now, the way this works is technically the state offers the name. It is not the officer's consent. In theory, it's the state that offers a name, but in practice, it is the officer saying, I'm willing to go, I'm not willing to go.
Yeah.
But there have been times when state CMs enforced this rule and said, you are an All India Service Officer, you are not a provincial guy. And that is the distinction. You claim elitism, you claim superiority over my state administrative service officer, and on that ground, you get faster promotions. And the obverse of that is, you will go to Government of India. Ninth year, from a lord of a district, you will become a lowly deputy secretary sitting in Asia House in 1.5 rooms, in a room which is 1/100 the size of your collectorate. But that's the way you learn work, and that's the way it is, and you have to go. And this was enforced strictly. When that loosened, states would stop sending people. That is, some states, whether they wanted to send people or not, people lobbied and came into Delhi. So once this balance was sort of undone, some states began to be overrepresented in Delhi. And typically the pattern would be the fugitive category. And the other thing, and which I have anecdotally mentioned to you and given you examples, a direct reflection of very often the cadres of the deciding people in Delhi. If the deciding people, the guys who decide the postings, the officers who decide postings, you will have greater access to them if you are from their cadre. And if they are a little less objective than is expected of those positions, those cadres also began to get represented more. I think that is the beginning of this breakdown.
We'll talk about in our next conversation how much of this may not have been a bad thing, in that how much of the original design needed to be changed and critiqued and evolved, and how much of it lands us in the kind of deep waters of urgent need for civil service reform. But before we end today, I wanted to sort of ask you two things. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of interconnections here between the explicit changes, particularly changes in promotion, changes in age, linked to that, the whole sort of reservation thing, which changes the character, and some of the more implicit changes that we just talked about in terms of cadre allocation. But we are also seeing a new change that's sort of coming up a lot in the newspapers today when we think about civil service reporting, which is that perhaps because of the vacancies, the low levels of recruitment, the difficulties of filling up the central cadres, there is a move to break the IAS monopoly in many of the Government of India positions by bringing in other parts of the All India services. So IPS officers coming in as secretaries in line departments, forest service officers coming in policy-making positions. Your paper talks about some of this. It was happening, I think, already, but with a large representation of the IAS. Some of the data I'm beginning to see now seems to suggest that because of consistent vacancies and difficulties in filling up the central cadre, you're now seeing more of this. Just wanted you to talk to us a little bit about this trend and what you make of it.
Thank you. I don't think it's as yet a large enough number. For instance, let's talk of today. I think the number of Indian Forest Service secretaries, the number of Indian Police Service secretaries is no more than what it used to be. There are a couple of standard positions, secretary level positions. I think the DG Forests and a couple of positions in the Ministry of Environment and Forest, and in the MHA, in the Ministry of Home Affairs, there is a special secretary or I don't know what he's called today. I think it's probably called secretary. So there are a couple of positions which were always personed by people from the other All India services. I don't think as yet it is a very large number. But I think you're right about the trend. The small cadre sizes that we saw in the early mid-90s will actually come to fruition 30 years or so from the time of recruitment. So I think you will now see the sheer physical non-availability of enough IAS officers. Now, we are not going into the whether it's a good thing, bad thing, I mean, value judgments apart. There may be a lot of merit in non-IAS officers becoming secretary. That's a different debate, and I think it's a debate worth having. But I'm just on the numbers now. I think that will be an important trend. 2, the number of IAS officers coming as deputy secretaries, directors, and joint secretary level officers has also seen a serious decline, partly on account of this reduced number, but also partly on account of the very differential in reality pay and perks of the union and the state. States are also desperately short of IAS officers for the same reason. So the average IAS officer in his 12th or in her 14th year, 15th year of service in a state is typically holding on an average 1.5 to 2 jobs, holding additional charge of X position. Y position is the main substantive charge. Plus, typically, unlike in the past, resource constraints on personal entitlements have almost entirely evaporated. And I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, but the average IAS officer in the 14th, 15th year typically will have very comfortable, almost entirely state provided housing, multiple cars, a board position or a CEO position, which also gives you access to a lot of other kinds of perks. As opposed to all that, remember, you land up here as Deputy Secretary, Internal Security 1 in MHA. You are sitting in the second floor in a half a room and in office till 10, 11, 12 on an average, writing difficult reports about law and order situations elsewhere, but desperately required work because internal security is core, and I'm taking only security. You will have likewise social justice, you'll have women and child development, you have Department of Disabilities. So these are all serious positions where you require good quality deputy secretaries. You're simply not getting officers. Now, the result is a lot of these positions are now occupied almost entirely by other services. I'm not on the desirability, I'm just stating a fact. Now, if this trend continues, the old argument that the IAS used to wield, that I am qualified to be Joint Secretary Internal Security because I have been District Magistrate, I have been Subdivisional Magistrate, and I have been Deputy Secretary, say Defense or Border Management, it's gone because you've not done any of these hard jobs. So it's a matter of time before people who do these hard jobs will command their positions as joint secretaries, and secretary's position is 10 years away. So I don't yet see this happening, but I think you are right in visualizing something like this emerging.
So thank you so much, KP. I think we've today gone through a very interesting sort of narrative of the kinds of both policy directed and implicit changes within the IAS, or rather the All India Civil Service, All India Services more generally over the course of time, from where the original design was to where we are in the contemporary. And I think it raises very important questions, which I hope we can delve into in our next conversation, about the tensions that we are seeing. There was an imagination of what the civil services was supposed to do, and its design was structured accordingly. There is a new place to which it has come. and it's not entirely clear which logic we ought to be following going forward. So both understanding the tensions and I think also critiquing, because there is always the question on everyone's mind, was the original design appropriate then for what the state is supposed to do? So in our next episode, I hope we'll tackle these as we also get into some of the more difficult questions that are often confronted when we think about civil service reforms, which are questions around politicization, questions around corruption, questions around inefficiency. So we have lots more to discuss over the next 2 episodes of our series, and look forward to all of you joining us again. Thank you. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and on our website www.cprindia.org.